Okay, so since we're talking about the reproductive system, I want to talk a little bit about how the reproductive system forms and differentiates. It's really the only system that is vastly different in males and females, and so there are some interesting things about how the control of it is determined. So a lot of people think that sex determination is just a matter of chromosomes. That, like, boys have an X and a Y, and girls have an X and an X. While that's true mostly as far as it goes, the process is actually a lot more complicated than that, and there are a number of places where you can get unusual variances that we're going to talk about. But at its most basic level, at the chromosomal level, all humans have 22, well, phenotypically normal humans, have 22 pairs of autosomes, those are non-sex chromosomes, and one pair of sex chromosomes. In males, this is typically an X and a Y, which are non-homologous and carry different genes. And in females, it's two X's, which are homologous and usually carry the same gene. All eggs should carry an X chromosome because that's all a female has to give them. And for sperm, half of the sperm should contain Y, and half of the sperm should contain X. So when the sperm unites with the egg, you either get an X sperm and an X egg, leading to female development, or you have a Y sperm and a Y egg, leading to male development. And that's sort of the very, very high level. Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. All right. So first off, all developing humans are default female. If nothing happens, a fertilized egg will develop as a female. It is the presence of the Y chromosome that determines maleness. Actually, it's the presence of a specific gene on the Y chromosome, but we'll get to that in just a second. Now, when I say that all fetuses, like, start off female, that's not quite true. Without a Y chromosome, all fetuses will develop male. However, all fetuses start off with both potential sets of sex organs. So you can see, this is called an undifferentiated state. This is very, very early in development. You don't need to memorize all of these names, but you do need to kind of understand the logic of the process. You have a clump of cells called a gonadal ridge, and it is surrounded by the mesonephros, and on the outside you have the mesonephric duct, also called the Mullerian duct, and you have the mesonephric duct. Those are two different things. Now, this is at 5 to 6 weeks. Once you get 7 to 8 weeks, one of two things happens. Either a protein called testes determining factor, or TDF, is made, and that puts the developing embryo down a male pathway, or it's not made and you go down a female pathway. Testing's determining factor is found on the Y chromosome. And it is, well, there are other genes on the Y chromosome, this is the main one. This is the one that if you have it, you develop typically male. Again, there's a few complications to that. But if you have testes determining factor, then your gonadal ridge will develop into testes, and your mesonephric duct will develop into the epididymis and vas deferens, and your this area here will develop into the bladder. If we go further down, like to basically an at-birth state, the testes, which initially form in the abdomen, descend into two separate packs that will eventually become the scrotum. And the penis develops around the urogenital sinus, basically the urethra. If testes determining factor does not get made, then the gonadal ridge will develop as ovaries. In this case, the mesonephric duct, that's this inner one, degrades. And the Mullerian duct stays around. Back here, under male development, the Mullerian duct degraded. Testes determining factor causes the Mullerian duct to degrade. Here we have the mesonephric duct degrading and the Mullerian duct sticking around, and the Mullerian duct will develop into this structure up here, which will become the uterine or fallopian tubes as they reach around and basically wrap around the developing ovaries. And down here, where the Mullerian ducts fuse together, that fusion will develop into the uterus. So if we look further down at near basically near the end of gestation, you can see that you have a fully developed uterus, your uterine tubes, and ovaries, and this area here has developed into the vaginal wall, and the urinary bladder is moved aside so that you can see these structures in here. All that's necessary for this to happen is that you not have testes determining factor. So, the main thing is whether you make testes determining factor, you make testes, and you keep the mesonephric duct, or you don't have testes determining factor, you make ovaries, and your Mullerian duct or mesonephric duct turns into the uterine tubes and uterus structures. So remember that testes determining factor that I was talking about? Well, the testes determining factor is the name of the protein. The gene is called SRY. And this gene makes testes determining factor. SRY stands for sex-determining region of the Y chromosome. If you have a functional SRY gene, you make testes-determining factor, and you develop testes. If you don't, then you develop ovaries and uterus. Now, there are some people who have, say, a Y chromosome. Let me draw a Y chromosome here. The Y chromosome is this tiny little chromosome. Let's say that this is the SRY gene right there. What happens if you get a mutation in that gene? Everything else on the Y chromosome is present, but that gene is defective. In that case, you won't make testes-determining factor. So if you don't have the SRY, then you develop female. There are people, about something like 1% or between 0.1 and 1% of phenotypic females have XY chromosomes. They have an X and a Y, but they have a mutant SRY gene. It's not totally uncommon. So these are XY females. They still have the other genes on the Y chromosome, so it has a tendency to kind of influence their development a bit. They usually end up taller with somewhat more toned muscles than a chromosomally normal female. But other than that, they develop totally normal as a female. They've got ovaries, they've got a uterus, they're, sometimes tall, kind of athletic. You tend to find them more often than normal in two professions, supermodels and athletes, two fields where it advantages you to be kind of tall. But other than that, they're normal. Another possibility is you could actually have, let's go, let's say you have a Y chromosome and an X chromosome, and this here is the SRY gene. It's sometimes possible for this to break off and then get transferred to the end of the X chromosome. So this would happen in a male, and they would produce an X chromosome that has an SRY gene. Which means that if they pass this on to the next generation, you would have an XX individual, but one of those X's would have SRY. And this person would develop with testes. The fact that they're missing all of the other Y genes and that they've got the double dose of X means that they will often develop with somewhat feminized characteristics, but under most circumstances they will be anatomically male because they have the SRY gene. Now, that determines the internal state, whether you develop testes or ovaries, and whether you develop a vas deferens or a uterus. But the external genitalia, i.e., what you see when you look naked into a mirror or something like that, all of the obvious bits, are not determined by SRY. They're determined by other things. In males, it's typically determined by testosterone. And the absence of testosterone leads to female development. Again, the female was the default state. Now, in either case, you're developing from the same default structure, from this androgynous, undifferentiated state. And so, basically, all of the organs in males and females have an analog, right? So the analog of testes is ovaries. The analog of the fallopian tubes is the vas deferens. But this is true even for other structures as well. So, for instance, the head or glands of the penis is analogous to the clitoris. They develop from the same tissue. The other portions of the penis that enfold the urethra in males form the labia minora in females. The labia majora and the scrotum are made from the same tissue. You can usually tell, or at least in theory, the genitalia are distinctly formed by about week 12. Now, let's talk about another way that things can go wrong. As I said, SRY and testes determining factor determine whether you have testes or ovaries in the uterus. Later on, those testes will begin to secrete high levels of testosterone. If you have ovaries, you don't secrete high levels of testosterone. All of the other changes that we just talked about, growing a penis instead of a clitoris, growing a scrotum instead of labia, that sort of thing. All of those changes are due to the interaction of testosterone with receptors on different cell types. And if you have testes, you usually make testosterone. However, there's a certain number of people that have a defect in their testosterone receptor. So they might be making testosterone, which I'm going to draw as a T here, just fine, and usually there's a T receptor and that leads to male characteristics. However, suppose that you have testosterone, but your testosterone receptor, let's do this in red, is broken. Even though you have testosterone present, you don't develop male characteristics, you develop female characteristics. Now, when I say characteristics, I'm not talking about testes. Or I'm not talking about ovary and uterus, but all of the other things. So the development of those relies on this interaction between testosterone and the receptor. So in this case, even though you have testes, you have testosterone, without the ability to bind the receptor, the external characteristics develop as female. These individuals are typically labeled female at birth. They're usually born with typically female characteristics. They have anatomically normal vagina, but they have a pair of undescended testes where the ovaries should be, and they usually have no uterus. That having been said, unless somebody does an ultrasound or something, or has some sort of suspicion, everything externally looks normal. They're usually released from the hospital. You got a healthy baby girl. Now, without ovaries and without a uterus, you don't menstruate. And in fact, without ovaries, you can't make the estrogen and progesterone necessary for normal female development at puberty. So these individuals are usually, well, pretty much always sterile. They usually grow up phenotypically female until they hit puberty. And when they hit puberty, they typically fail to menstruate. And, sometimes you think you just might be late. But eventually you realize it's not going to happen. And there are often other developmental issues that come into play at around puberty as well. They're karyotype, meaning if you take a look at their chromosomes, they're XY. And they're going to test for high levels of testosterone. Often very high levels of testosterone. But it doesn't matter because their cells can't detect it. These individuals with Androgen-Insensitivity Syndrome is what this is called, as testosterone is an androgen and you're insensitive to it. These individuals are often, depending upon how broken the testosterone receptor is, sometimes it's like a little functional, sometimes it's not functional at all, sometimes it's mostly functional but not. These people can exist anywhere on the spectrum towards having, from female genitalia to male genitalia. So some of them, most of them are phenotypically female, but some of them are born phenotypically ambiguous. Some of them are born phenotypically female, but when they hit puberty, like, they start making enough testosterone that it causes their body to start becoming male, and they begin to grow penis, and their testes descend, which is probably kind of awkward. Typically, if they want to continue living as a hormonally normal female, they will require hormone treatments, estrogen, progesterone, in order to continue female development through puberty. So in males, usually, so the testes develop just exactly where the ovaries do at the beginning, and at around 8 months, typically, the testes will descend through a tube into the scrotum. And they should have dropped by the time the infant is born. However, in a certain percentage of people, one or both of the testes gets stuck and does not descend properly. This is called orchism. Orc is the ORCH is the Latinate prefix that means testes. And crypt means hidden. So this is hidden testes. It's called an undescended testicle, and usually requires treatment. If you leave it alone, sometimes they'll descend within like the first 1 to 3 years. But if it persists longer than that, undescended, then usually it requires surgical correction, and it's a good idea to get the surgical correction. It's not necessary in all cases, but having an undescended testicle up in there can cause inflammation and other problems later on down the road. So that's cryptorchidism. All right, and that pretty much takes us through the development of the reproductive system and most of the disorders of development. And so all we have left to cover is pathologies of the reproductive system.